This is Andy Orm of O'Reilly Media, talking with Shahid Shah, who I've had many useful conversations with. Shahid is the CEO of Netspective, and he's been a long-time advocate of open source in healthcare and the use of data to improve healthcare. So, Shahid, welcome.
Thanks, Andy. Good to have you.
You were talking today about service-oriented architectures in healthcare, and I'm going to assume that the readers, the listeners, can look that up for themselves, and they know what a service-oriented architecture is.
Right.
So tell me, have we made progress? What evidence have you seen of this happening in healthcare?
Yeah, so service-oriented architectures are fairly well understood. Today's talk is really more about how service-oriented architectures that are being put into place may slightly be failing us or are not being put into place fast enough to be able to have data being useful. So this whole conversation that we're having at Strata Rx, which is awesome over the last 3 days, has been about how to make data more useful, how to make it matter more, and basically the only way data will matter is if we use it. And the only way that we're going to use it in industry, in the healthcare industry especially, is if people can trust it and they can access it. So we've been trying to solve the problem of access to data using service-oriented architecture, web-oriented architecture, a lot of modern techniques. And the good news is we're actually making significant strides in moving towards service-oriented architecture. The problem is that all of our good intentions of service-oriented architecture are now taking data which used to be siloed in applications to now be siloed in smaller services. So the data is still not as fluid and as liquid and as accessible as it needs to be, even though we're promoting service-oriented architecture and web-oriented architecture as the way of opening that up. And primarily, the issues surround the fact that we don't treat data the way that we treat code. For example, if you create code today, if you're going to create a new module, a new class, anything in any language, at a minimum you're going to revision control it. At a minimum you're going to say who the developer was that created it, who committed it, how it might have branched from one piece of code to another, how these two pieces of code in two different applications would connect to each other. You document it appropriately. But data, we don't really treat like that. That's why service-oriented data is really, really important in service-oriented architectures. And if we don't keep improving that, data still remains inaccessible directly, which means we can't use it, which means we don't trust it, and we can't access it.
Do you want to have data provenance and have it marked for quality and have it tagged in some way?
Exactly. I think that it seems like such a easy thing, and we say that absolutely we should do that, but how should we do it? So there are techniques that we can use, things like we do in Git or other modern distributed revision control systems, where we treat code with full provenance and without any governance, right? You hear a lot about, we need a lot of data governance. Nobody talks about code governance because code is governed from the bottom up. And if we start to think about service-oriented data in that same way, in that data is well understood as a fact when it is created, but then how it is managed, the metadata around it, the provenance for it, the confidence levels we have with it, can the data be mixed and merged with other things, how is it secured, how is it accessible, that kind of metadata, there are several ways of thinking about it. One way is to create documents, as we do today, right? If you create a data warehouse or something, you have the warehouse, it has all of this data that came from 50 different places, but if you look in the warehouse, you have no clue where it came from. There's a document that you are given that says, okay, this column came from that source and this column came from that source, and we need to really be pushing all of that into service-oriented data so that data resides and all the metadata around it can be managed together.
So it sounds that if two data sets are joined, you would make sure that you didn't forget where each one came from and what
Precisely.
It means to have it come from there.
Exactly. And the way just the same way that we do code. So if we're going to do merges of two code bases, we often know what code bases they were merged from. So that's why in my talk I really mention what's the best way to manage data. If you don't know, if you don't have governance in place, etc., just treat it like code and see what that means to you. And if you know what that means and can put it into place and do it the same way that we do code, great. If not, let's come up with the techniques and approaches that we would do. Because it's taken us decades to do it for code. It's going to take us a little bit longer to do it with data, but we've got all of this history that we can use.
Yes, but going back to the 1980s, we have the free software movement, which was really an inspiration for so many other open movements, including open data. So there's a lot of talk around here also of giving the patient control over data. And it seems like there's a lot of institutions not only taking data out of patient hands, but out of doctors' hands, out of the individual's hands. So is there a way to put individuals back in control of the data that they generated?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons you see senior management, I mean, for us as open source advocates and open data advocates, we cringe and say, what the heck is wrong with these guys? Why are they closing this out? It all boils down to data only matters when we use it, and we only use it when we trust it. And so when you have senior folks saying, no, well, I can't have data entered by a patient because I can't trust, did the patient enter it, or did the doctor change it, and then did the doctor alter it, and then the nurse came and touched it? So if we treat data like code, we would know exactly where it came from. So if a piece of data, if a vital sign from my body today came from a device, and I knew throughout the process that it came from a device, I would treat it differently than if a patient entered it. So if a patient entered it, and I know the original value, a physician reviewed it or a nurse reviewed it, and I knew a new value because she noticed that they had misentered it and she has corrected it. If we choose to use the data from each one of these individual parties, we need to trust it. And the only way to trust it is to know where it came from, what the sources were, how did it go through the pathways. So we absolutely should cringe when anyone tries to close data, but let's try to figure out, why are we closing access to that data? Is it because we're trying to restrict choice and not allow a person to know what is their own diagnosis, et cetera, which is all bad news? Or is it because the person who's trying to restrict that data is trying to increase its trust to make it more useful in potentially some other workflows? So there may be a variety of reasons why data is being closed off. Some of them nefarious, others not so nefarious, just practical reasons.
So perhaps since we should wrap up, give me an overview of what the service-oriented architecture would contain. It would have the data, which would be in some kind of a repository that's being curated this way, and then maybe services on top of that. Are there services now?
Yes, absolutely. Services are very, very important, but the way that, if you see what we've been seeing over the last 10 or 20 years in object-oriented programming, lots of developers, especially the younger developers coming in, they often create a tight coupling between their functions within their classes and the data associated with those classes. And then we take data from classes and push it in and out of databases, and then we see the impedance mismatch when that occurs. That same thing happens in service-oriented architectures. If you created a service that was functional in nature, but tied so closely to its database that you couldn't make use of that data outside of that service, then what you've actually done is closed off and made your system less service-oriented rather than more service-oriented. So our services that we're doing must be treating their data as independently as possible. So try to create as few relationships inside the databases as possible, so that data can be used when it's, not if it's migrated, but when it is. We know no data stands still anymore. Data is moved all the time. So now we know that data can and will be moved without its associated service. How does the service, how is it written, how is it created, packaged, deployed, etc., when it knows that data that it's working with can, should, and must be independent of the function that it's wrapping around it. So we've done a great job with services and tying the data together, etc., in the cases when we're using service-oriented architecture, but now we're finding some of the problems associated with it is, instead of monolithic applications, we now have monolithic services, and the data is still trapped behind now a different micro wall instead of the complete wall that used to be with full applications.
This sounds like a typical problem in the relational world, where someone has written an SQL statement asking for 4 particular columns, and then that statement's all over the application, and then the columns change.
Exactly.
Sort of thing. Exactly. And I think a lot of researchers in healthcare in particular are looking only at that one experiment that just got funded,
right, and
not looking at others.
That's right. And then they lock it down accidentally. They don't do it on purpose, but if we don't treat data like code, we're going to do bad things like this. The same way before we had revision control, all kinds of bad things happened with code. We didn't know where it came from, how was it going to go, who was going to test it. But things got better once we started putting a little bit of rigor around the revision control of code.
Thank you, Shahid.
Sure. All right.